There are objects people collect because they are old, others because they are valuable. And then there are the ones that quietly pass from one owner to the next, leaving behind stories no one can fully explain. Estate sales, flea markets, forgotten attics. They're filled with items that once belonged to strangers. Most carry nothing more than dust and history, but every so often an object surfaces that seems to bring something else with it. A pattern of events. Unexplained illnesses. Strange sounds in the middle of the night. Swarms of insects appearing where there should be none. Families who refuse to speak about what happened after bringing a single item home. This case begins at a crowded summer flea market, where a 16-year-old girl bought a small, antique wooden box as an innocent gift for her older sister. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't particularly beautiful. Yet everyone who later described it remembered the same details: the unusually cold wood, the carvings that looked almost like insects crawling beneath the surface, and a feeling that the box somehow didn't belong among the ordinary antiques surrounding it. Inside, they found three things: a human tooth, a carefully preserved black beetle, and a handwritten note containing a single sentence. "I'm free now, and you're next." At first, the family laughed. Within hours, one of them was lying unconscious in a room that inexplicably filled with hundreds of insects. The box was eventually burned, or at least, that's what everyone believed, because only weeks later, another family, living miles away with no known connection to the first, opened what appeared to be the very same box. And according to every surviving account, it contained exactly the same three objects. According to the earliest witness statements, the incident began on an unusually hot Saturday in late July. The family involved has never publicly identified the exact town where the events took place, but multiple accounts describe it as a quiet, Midwestern community where the annual summer flea market attracted hundreds of visitors every year. It was the kind of event where people searched for forgotten treasures: old furniture, military memorabilia, handwritten letters, antique clocks, jewelry boxes, and dusty collections that had spent decades hidden away in basements and garages. 16-year-old Emily Carter attended the market with her father that afternoon. Friends later described Emily as curious but practical, someone who loved photography and old objects because of the stories they carried rather than any belief in the paranormal. Her older sister, Sarah, had a small collection of antiques displayed throughout her bedroom. She often visited estate sales, convinced that every worn photograph, cracked mirror, or rusted pocket watch had once been part of someone else's life. Nothing about that Saturday suggested it would become the beginning of an incident still discussed years later. The weather was unusually humid. Dust drifted through the narrow rows of vendor booths each time the warm breeze picked up. Somewhere in the distance, children laughed as carnival music played from speakers near a food truck. Vendors called out discounted prices while collectors carefully examined shelves filled with forgotten belongings whose original owners had long since disappeared. Emily almost walked past the table. It belonged to an elderly vendor who specialized in clearing abandoned storage units and estate sales. His booth was cluttered with dozens of unrelated objects stacked together without any obvious order. Tarnished silver frames leaned against cracked porcelain dolls. Boxes of faded postcards sat beside military medals whose owners' names had long been forgotten. That was when Emily noticed the box. It wasn't large, perhaps 8 inches across, but something about it immediately drew her attention. The wood was unusually dark, almost black in places, despite showing almost no signs of rot. Delicate carvings covered every side, intricate enough to resemble flowers from a distance. Only after picking it up did Emily realize the shapes looked less like petals and more like insects intertwined with one another. Tiny legs, curved wings, thin segmented bodies that seemed almost impossible to follow with the eye. She later admitted she couldn't explain why she reached for it. It just felt Different, she reportedly told a relative months afterward. Not beautiful, not valuable, just different. She was surprised by its weight. For something so small, it felt unusually heavy. Stranger still, the wood was noticeably cold despite sitting in direct sunlight for hours. Emily laughed and mentioned it to the vendor. Feels like it came out of a freezer. The old man didn't smile. Instead, witnesses remembered him hesitating before quietly saying, "If you're buying it, don't leave it closed forever." Emily assumed he was joking. When she asked where it had come from, the vendor simply shrugged. Bought out an estate a few counties over, whole basement full of old junk. No family wanted any of it. Nothing about his answer seemed unusual at the time. She paid $15 in cash. The vendor wrapped the box in old newspaper without another word. As Emily and her father walked away, neither of them noticed the elderly man continuing to watch them through the crowd until they disappeared between the rows of tents. Years later, Emily's father would insist there was one detail he never told investigators because it sounded too ridiculous. When they loaded their purchases into the truck, Emily placed the wrapped box on the passenger seat. A few seconds later, she frowned. The newspaper had shifted slightly. Not because the truck moved, not because of the wind, but because something beneath the paper had produced a single dull sound, a soft knock, from inside the box. By the time they arrived home, the strange sound had already been dismissed. Emily assumed something inside the box had shifted during the drive. Her father suggested a loose hinge or an old piece of wood expanding in the summer heat. Neither of them gave it another thought. The box remained wrapped in newspaper until that evening. Sarah had been waiting. She loved antiques, not because she believed they possessed supernatural qualities, but because she believed every old object preserved fragments of forgotten lives. She spent weekends restoring broken clocks, identifying photographs she found inside abandoned albums, and researching the owners of engraved jewelry purchased at estate sales. When Emily handed her the package, Sarah smiled immediately. "You actually found something interesting." She carefully removed the yellowed newspaper and placed the wooden box on her bedroom desk beneath a reading lamp. For several minutes, she simply examined it without opening it. Her fingertips traced the carved patterns along the lid while she tried to determine its age. "It doesn't look handmade," she murmured. "But it doesn't look machine-made either." Their father leaned against the bedroom door and laughed. "You paid $15 for an old sewing box." Sarah shook her head. "No." She looked unusually serious. "I don't think this was ever meant to store sewing supplies." Emily later admitted she found that comment strangely unsettling, though she couldn't explain why. The lid didn't open easily. It felt as though it had been sealed shut for years. Sarah had to press both thumbs against the edge before the lock finally released with a dry wooden crack. Inside, there was no jewelry, no hidden compartment, no valuables. Only 3 carefully arranged objects. In the center rested a single human tooth. It wasn't a child's tooth. It appeared to be an adult molar, slightly yellowed with age but surprisingly well preserved. Beside it lay a large black beetle. Unlike an ordinary dead insect, this one had been professionally mounted. Its legs were spread naturally, almost as though it belonged in a museum display. Even after all those years, the shell reflected a dull, oily shine beneath the desk lamp. Underneath both objects was a folded envelope. No address, no name, nothing written on the outside. Sarah unfolded the brittle paper while Emily leaned over her shoulder. The note contained only one handwritten sentence. "I'm free now, and you're next." Silence filled the room. Then Emily burst into laughter. Someone really committed to the joke. Even their father chuckled. Probably some teenager trying to scare antique collectors. It seemed like the only reasonable explanation. People hid strange things inside old furniture all the time. Practical jokes, time capsules, odd collections. There was nothing supernatural about any of it. Sarah folded the note again. "I'll keep everything together." She returned the tooth, the preserved beetle, and the letter exactly as she had found them before gently closing the lid. Looking back, Emily would later tell investigators that this decision haunted her more than anything else. If we'd thrown those things away right then... She never finished the sentence. The family spent the rest of the evening exactly as they always had. Dinner. Television. Their father fell asleep in his recliner before 11. Emily finished homework in her room while Sarah remained upstairs, cataloguing her newest antique in a notebook she kept for every unusual item she acquired. Nothing seemed out of place. Just after midnight, however, Emily noticed something unusual. The house had become unnaturally quiet. No humming refrigerator, no air conditioner cycling on, no distant traffic outside. It was the kind of silence people rarely notice until every familiar sound disappears. Then, knock. A single dull knock echoed somewhere upstairs. Emily looked toward the hallway. A few seconds passed. Knock. This time it sounded closer. Not loud, not violent, just slow and deliberate. She assumed Sarah was still awake, but when she called her name, there was no answer. Only another hollow knock, as though something made of wood was being struck gently from the inside. Emily waited for another sound. For nearly half a minute, the hallway remained completely silent. Then came a third knock. It wasn't louder than the first two. If anything, it was softer. But there was something about its rhythm that immediately felt wrong. It wasn't random. Whoever, or whatever, was making the sound seemed to be waiting between each knock, almost as though it expected someone to come closer. Emily stepped into the hallway. The upstairs lights were off except for the faint glow escaping beneath Sarah's bedroom door. The air felt unusually cool. Not dramatically colder, just enough for the sudden change to be noticeable after the humid summer evening. She rubbed her arms, assuming the air conditioning had finally switched back on. It hadn't. The thermostat downstairs later showed the system had never activated. She walked toward Sarah's room. The knocking stopped. For a moment, she almost laughed at herself. Maybe Sarah had dropped something. Maybe an old piece of furniture had shifted as the house cooled during the night. She knocked gently on the bedroom door. "Sarah." No answer. She pushed the door open. The reading lamp was still on. The antique box remained exactly where Sarah had left it on the nightstand. Everything else appeared perfectly normal, until she looked at the bed. Sarah lay completely still beneath the blankets. Her breathing was slow, far too slow. "Sarah?" Emily crossed the room and touched her shoulder. No reaction. She shook her slightly. Nothing. Her sister wasn't simply asleep. She seemed impossible to wake. Emily called her name again, louder this time. Still nothing. Then she noticed movement near the window. A single black beetle crawled across the windowsill. She frowned. The bedroom windows had been closed all evening. Before she could think much about it, another insect appeared near the dresser. Then another. One emerged from beneath the bed. Another crawled across the edge of the rug. Within seconds, she realized they weren't all coming from the same direction. They seemed to be appearing everywhere at once. The insects looked almost identical to the preserved beetle inside the wooden box. Glossy black shells, long legs, slow, deliberate movements. Emily's stomach tightened. "Dad." She ran into the hallway. Her father reached the room less than 20 seconds later. At first, he focused only on Sarah. He checked her pulse. It was present, but unusually weak. He tried calling her name. He gently slapped her cheek. Nothing. Even lifting her eyelids produced almost no response. It was unlike anything either of them had ever seen. Then he noticed the insects. Several dozen now covered parts of the floor. Others crawled along the baseboards. One disappeared beneath the nightstand where the antique box still sat undisturbed. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Her father finally walked to the window. Locked. He checked the second window. Also locked. There were no torn screens, no cracks, no obvious openings. Nothing that could explain how so many insects had entered the room. The strange part wasn't just their number. It was their behavior. Instead of scattering from the flashlight or footsteps, they moved slowly through the room as though completely undisturbed by the people around them. Almost organized. Emily would later say she never actually saw where they came from. Only that every time she looked away, there were more. Her father grabbed his phone and dialed 911. As he spoke with the dispatcher, Emily remained beside the bed, desperately trying to wake her sister. That's when she heard it again. Knock. Very soft. Very close. She immediately looked toward the bedroom door. Nothing. The sound came again. Knock. Not from the walls. Not from the window. Not from beneath the floor. She slowly turned toward the nightstand. The antique box hadn't moved. Its lid remained tightly closed. Yet, as the room filled with crawling insects, Emily became convinced the sound wasn't echoing through the bedroom at all. It was coming from inside the box. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes. By the time the paramedics entered the bedroom, Emily estimated there were well over 100 insects scattered throughout the room. Some crawled across the walls. Others disappeared beneath furniture or gathered in the corners where the light barely reached. None of them appeared aggressive. They simply existed, filling the room in a way that made no sense. One of the paramedics immediately knelt beside Sarah. Her pulse was steady, blood pressure slightly low, breathing shallow but regular. There were no signs of trauma, no visible injuries, no evidence of poisoning. He shined a penlight into her eyes. Her pupils reacted normally. Physiologically, she should have been awake, yet she remained completely unresponsive. The second paramedic paused for a brief moment, looking around the bedroom. "Where are all these bugs coming from?" Emily's father answered honestly. "We don't know." The paramedic inspected the windows, then the air vent near the ceiling. Everything appeared sealed. There was no obvious nest, no damaged wall, no broken screen that might explain what they were seeing. He didn't say anything else. Instead, he quietly helped carry Sarah downstairs. Years later, Emily would recall one detail that never appeared in any official paperwork. As the stretcher was rolled through the hallway, dozens of insects remained inside Sarah's bedroom. Not one followed them out. It was almost as though they refused to leave the room. The emergency department ruled out the obvious possibilities first: blood tests, neurological examinations, toxicology screening, a CT scan. Every result came back normal. The attending physician described Sarah's condition as an unexplained episode of profound unconsciousness, without any immediately identifiable medical cause. She wasn't in a coma. She wasn't sedated. Her brain activity appeared normal. She simply wouldn't wake up. Nearly 6 hours later, shortly after sunrise, Sarah suddenly opened her eyes. She looked exhausted, confused, as though she had slept for days. Doctors immediately began asking questions. Did she remember collapsing? No. Did she remember feeling sick? No. Did she consume alcohol or medication? No. Her memory ended the moment she had closed the antique box the night before. There was only one thing she remembered after that. I had a dream. The room became quiet. It didn't feel like a dream. She described being trapped inside a narrow wooden space. It was completely dark. She couldn't move her arms. The air smelled damp, almost moldy. Somewhere above her, someone kept knocking. Slow, patient. Always 3 knocks. She said she spent what felt like hours trying to answer by hitting the wood above her. But nobody ever opened it. The physicians exchanged brief glances before moving on to the next question. No one attempted to interpret the dream. Stress alone could easily explain vivid nightmares after an unexplained medical event. At least, that was the simplest explanation. Back at the house, Emily and her father were trying to understand what had happened. Oddly enough, the insects were gone. Almost all of them. Only a handful remained near Sarah's bedroom window. An exterminator, who later inspected the property, reportedly found no infestation, no nest, and no obvious explanation for how such a large number of beetles could have appeared so suddenly inside a sealed room. He suggested they may have entered through an opening that could no longer be identified. It was a reasonable theory. It just didn't explain why every insect had appeared almost exclusively inside one bedroom, or why they had vanished only hours later. Emily's father didn't want the box inside the house any longer. He put on a pair of work gloves before touching it. For several seconds, he simply stared at the carved lid. Then he reopened it. The tooth remained exactly where it had been placed. The preserved beetle hadn't moved. The folded note was still inside. Nothing appeared different. Nothing, except for one thing. The handwritten message was no longer the same. Emily would later insist she saw it with her own eyes before her father quietly folded the paper shut again. The original sentence, "I'm free now, and you're next," was still there. But beneath it, written in the same faded ink, was a second line. One that neither sister remembered seeing the night before. It read, "You opened it." Emily expected her father to call the police. Instead, he walked silently out to the backyard carrying the box with both hands, still wearing the same work gloves he had put on inside the house. He didn't speak until he reached an old metal burn barrel near the fence. "We're done with this." Those were the only words he said. He dropped the folded note, the tooth, and the preserved beetle back into the box exactly as they had been found. He closed the lid, poured lighter fluid over the wood, and struck a match. For a moment, nothing happened. The flame touched the box but seemed reluctant to spread. The lighter fluid burned away first, producing a brief flash before fading into thin smoke. Only then did the wood finally begin to blacken around the edges. Emily later described the smell as something she had never experienced before. It wasn't simply burning wood. It carried a strangely sweet odor mixed with something damp and rotten, almost like mold trapped beneath wet soil. Even years later, she claimed she could recognize that smell instantly whenever she entered an abandoned basement or old storage building. Neither she nor her father spoke while the box burned. Within minutes, it collapsed inward. The carved lid split apart. The flames consumed the paper first, then the beetle. Finally, the wood itself crumbled into glowing embers. Her father stirred the ashes with a shovel until nothing recognizable remained. The following morning, he buried the cooled remains behind the shed. For the first time since the flea market, the house felt normal again. No insects, no knocking, no strange odors. Sarah gradually recovered and was discharged from the hospital 2 days later. Although physically healthy, she refused to bring any more antiques into the house. She packed away her entire collection, telling Emily she no longer enjoyed owning objects whose history she couldn't trace. Life slowly returned to normal. Or at least, that is what everyone believed. Nearly 3 weeks later, Emily attended a birthday party for one of her closest friends, Megan. It was an ordinary suburban gathering. Music played quietly in the living room. Teenagers laughed around the kitchen table. Someone was recording short videos on a phone while presents were stacked beside the couch. Emily later said it was the first day she hadn't thought about the box, until Megan reached the final gift. It came from an uncle who frequently purchased unusual antiques at estate sales throughout the state. She smiled while tearing away the wrapping paper. Then Emily froze. The room suddenly felt much colder. Resting inside the opened package was a small wooden box. Same size, same dark wood, same intricate carvings that looked almost floral until viewed closely. Then they became insects. Emily immediately tried to convince herself it couldn't be the same one. Thousands of antique boxes existed. People copied old designs all the time. Her breathing slowed as she silently repeated every logical explanation she could think of. Megan lifted the lid. Inside lay a single human tooth. Beside it, a preserved black beetle. Beneath both objects, a folded envelope. Emily never waited to see the note. She already knew what it would say. Witnesses disagreed about what happened next. Some remembered her screaming. Others claimed she quietly grabbed Megan's arm and told her not to touch anything inside the box. One guest later insisted Emily simply walked out of the house without saying a single word. No version matches perfectly. What is documented is what happened later that night. Megan was admitted to the hospital after becoming suddenly unresponsive. Doctors suspected a severe allergic reaction. No clear cause was ever confirmed. According to one member of her family, she remained impossible to wake for several hours. Whether insects appeared inside the house has never been officially established. Some relatives denied it completely. Others claimed they found dozens of black beetles gathered beneath the kitchen cabinets the following morning before they disappeared without explanation. No photographs have ever surfaced. No exterminator's report has been located. Only conflicting witness accounts. Emily spent the following months trying to discover where the box had originated. She searched newspaper archives, county records, and estate sale listings dating back decades. Several reports caught her attention. Each described different families, different towns, different years. Yet the incidents shared unsettling similarities: unexplained unconsciousness, persistent knocking during the night, large numbers of insects appearing inside sealed rooms. None mentioned the box by name. None mentioned the note. Yet together they formed a pattern too strange for Emily to ignore. One final detail has remained impossible to verify. Multiple witnesses claim Megan's uncle later admitted purchasing the box during the liquidation of an abandoned farmhouse several counties away. When asked what happened to it afterward, he reportedly answered with complete confidence, "I don't know. I gave it away. No one has ever confirmed where it went next." Which may explain why, even today, antique dealers occasionally report customers asking about a small black wooden box with carvings that resemble insects. Most have never seen one. A few quietly claim they have, and every description is almost exactly the same. The only difference is the name of the person who opened it last. To this day, no one has been able to determine whether this case was the result of coincidence, misremembered events, psychological stress, or something far more difficult to explain. The simplest explanation is still the most reasonable one. Perhaps the first box was never the same as the second. Perhaps Emily's memories changed over time after experiencing a deeply traumatic event. Perhaps the insects had an ordinary source that investigators simply failed to identify. Perhaps the handwritten note wasn't identical at all, and later retellings unintentionally merged separate memories into a single story. Every one of those explanations is possible, yet they leave behind questions that have never been answered. Why did two families with no known connection to one another reportedly describe the same unusual contents? Why did both incidents involve an unexplained period of unconsciousness? Why did multiple witnesses independently mention the same slow knocking, always coming from somewhere they could never quite locate? And if the original box truly burned to ashes, what exactly did Megan open only weeks later? Researchers who have looked into similar reports occasionally point to old folklore surrounding objects believed to carry misfortune from one owner to the next. Historians generally dismiss those stories as modern legends, and no verified evidence has ever linked this case to any documented artifact or historical record, which leaves this incident exactly where it has remained for years, unexplained. Whether the box ever existed exactly as described, whether the witnesses unknowingly influenced one another, or whether an ordinary antique somehow became the center of an extraordinary series of events, can no longer be determined with certainty. One detail, however, appears again and again in nearly every version of the case. Emily reportedly stopped opening antique boxes altogether, not at flea markets, not at estate sales, not even when friends asked her to. Years later, she supposedly gave only one reason. Some things aren't forgotten because they're worthless. They're forgotten because someone wanted them to stay closed. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part of this entire case. Not the tooth, not the preserved beetle, not even the note, but the possibility that somewhere, on a dusty shelf at an estate sale, or inside a forgotten box in someone's attic, there may still be another small wooden box, waiting for someone curious enough to lift the lid